As I said earlier, we have a great double feature, and I won't use a lot of our time introducing them, but Michael R. and Laura Taylor are both with the West Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District, and their presentation is about managing understory vegetation. And that's really the short title. I think the long title is something like managing understory vegetation for beneficial uses. So it's not just about spraying blackberries. I thought, oh, good, I want to learn how to spray blackberries. That's not what this one's about. So you want to go ahead and share, Laura, and then you guys take it away. And I will just tell people I'm going to turn off my camera and mute myself. I would ask everyone to mute themselves. You can leave your cameras on or off, whatever you like. And if you put questions in the chat, after 30 minutes, we'll come into the Q&A and we'll be able to answer those. We'll also open it up for verbal questions. So here is Michael, I think. Nope, Laura. Take it away.
Well, hey there, everyone. Actually, it is Michael who's up.
Yeah, sorry, I was having trouble figuring out where my unmute button went. I use Zoom every day. What's going on? But now here I am. You can hear me, right?
Yep.
All right. So yeah, I'm Michael R. with the West Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District, and Laura and I will share with you tonight a bit about our understory species work. And I'm really kind of just setting it up, and then Laura will mostly take it away with the really great information. But with that, then we'll just launch right into it. If this works. So just a quick introductory slide. So we come to you from Portland tonight, and we work in the west side of Multnomah County in our Soil and Water Conservation District, which is within those red outlines that you can see on the map. We work with a lot of area that's around Forest Park. And then all of those orange shapes you see on there are tax lots where we've done forest management plans with those landowners. So we've worked with 60 some landowners on management planning, and a lot of those folks have implemented different projects with us. But like landowners that live in this area that are OSWA members, they tend to come to your all's meeting. And I think I saw a couple names on here that are actually West Multnomah landowners. So, and then the work that we're going to talk about, I'm kind of running my arrow along the crest of Skyline Boulevard, or the crest of the Tualatin Mountains. And then this area, of course, would drain to the Tualatin. And that's where our project sites were for what we're going to talk about. Having a little bit of an unresponsive screen. There we go. So I'll just jump right into some of the content here then. So why would someone want to enhance their forest understory in the first place? I know a lot of times we talk about growing trees, but we're also interested in a lot of the habitat features and those kinds of things too. So a lot of people will have erosion issues on their forests where they might need to get some seed in the ground to just stabilize the soil, which would be a nice understory project. And West Multnomah, as well as most of our surrounding conservation districts, we do a lot of invasive species control. So when we see ivy removed or other species like that, it's often nice to seed and replace them with something a little bit better. A lot of landowners will chat about having a fairly barren or bare understory, which we often will find under some of our Douglas fir plantations where there's just not all that much growing on the ground. And then aesthetics are a big thing. So some people want to manage understory vegetation just because they think it looks great. And this is kind of a panoramic view of a place in Forest Park right here. And those are all kind of just the things we find people asking us about when we go out on site visits. So one thing is kind of just to throw some data in there too is, I know a lot of you are familiar with the National Woodland Owner Survey that the Forest Service does every few years. And this is some 2016 data. And I know this is a pretty wordy slide, but it just kind of says that when family woodland owners are asked about their planned forest activities, about 58% of them plan on working on invasive weed control, which is a big thing, like I said, that we do. And then when they're asked about reasons for why they want to own woodlands, 2/3 of them basically cite some motivation for wildlife habitat or protecting nature or biological diversity. So people are really, really into this work, which is cool. So with that, this is my last slide before I kick it over to Laura. I think I jumped ahead there. But one thing I just wanted to point out, if it goes back to that slide or not, is that in the metro region of Portland, there's been a lot of work done on understory species control. And you can kind of see where that would come to be, because there is a lot of invasive species projects, like ivy is just chronic in Forest Park and areas like that. And so a big question was often like, when we get rid of that, maybe just the next invasive weed comes in if we don't do something. So Metro, Portland Bureau of Environmental Services, Clean Water Services, and Portland State University, we owe them a lot of thanks for starting to set up a bit of an understory project that we ended up tagging on to a little bit later. And part of the reason we did was we saw a grant opportunity from the Natural Resources Conservation Service through their Conservation Innovation Grant, where we were able to get $60,000 to help kind of launch this project and do some other associated work, like some of the weed control and some of the tree thinning. So thanks to all those partners that made this possible. And so with that, I'll kick it over to Laura, I think share the screen back so that she could talk more about the specific project that we did to really look at how to make this work happen.
All right, so if y'all can hear me, let's get into it. Sorry, technical difficulties here. Okay, so we did this study that Michael was kind of setting you up about, and we were basically trying to answer a couple main questions. The first is, how effective is it to establish native understory plants from seed? Being that seed is a lot more economical and easy to spread around than your usual sort of potted plants. Also, what species work best? And are there different species that are suited to different conditions in the forest? So what are those associations, and can we, kind of fine tune our species mix for different areas? So we had a general approach that we used to try to answer these questions. Basically, we chose a number of sites where we were already working with landowners on and had just kind of gotten started on weed removal and or forest thinning. So we chose those sites. And then we set up some experimental plots, just basic stuff, a circular plot about 11 feet in diameter. So we could really focus in on what was happening there and come back to the same place every time. And once we had that sort of baseline data collected from those plots, then we did treatments to the sites, which included both the forest treatments of, removing the invasive species or, thinning the forest, as well as then also in some cases raking the duff away. And then we seeded them, waited for a year or two. We waited 1 year, came back and measured our results, and then also did a second year of monitoring to see how things turned out. Okay, and so just a little bit more specifically about our plots. So just wanted to show you the different sort of experimental treatments we had. We did some plots where we raked away the needle duff and leaves, but then we didn't seed anything. So that was kind of our control. Next, we did the same kind of raking, but then seeded that area with a really diverse native mix of understory seeds. And then finally, we left some plots unraked and seeded with a little bit more simplistic mix. And that was to test if, any kind of seeding would work if we didn't rake, because we kind of had a hunch that the raking would help. And we also measured a number of environmental conditions. including, basic things like slope and aspect, also just forest type, a number of soil characteristics, and even how many worms were in a site. So this is if you're, curious about which particular species we seeded, this is our list. And, it's a lot of common things like waterleaf, Siberian miner's lettuce, piggyback plant, fringe cup, large-leaved avens. So things you probably see in your forest understory if it's, doing pretty well. And this is just some fun pictures of what it looked like when we were raking and seeding. You can see down there the little baggie of the seed. So that's about how much seed we used for our plot. And then we came back and took really careful, detailed notes on how many seedlings came up. You can see in the top right picture there, that's a plot that we seeded. So you can see there's a nice little green pool of seedlings coming up. So here's some of the exciting results we got. And our results now are even more detailed than when we talked about this at the soil school, or tree school, I should say. So just to start, here's some general pictures just to kind of give you a feel for what things look like in general. And we're going to start with the plots where we raked and then seeded. And this first shot is just of a blackberry site. So you can see in the top picture, that's before we did any seeding or raking, but after we mostly killed the blackberry. And then in the first year afterwards, you can really see a nice flush of seedlings coming in just where we seeded. So then also raked and seeded plot, but this is where we had vinca and ivy instead of blackberry to deal with. And the left is before we seeded and treated, and then the right is in our second year. So you can definitely see an exciting difference just visually. Okay, so then in contrast, our raked plots that we didn't seed, we certainly saw some plants come in sometimes. And sometimes it was just a couple of native species, and that was kind of about it. And other times it was kind of a mix of introduced weedy species. So, the non-native wall lettuce was pretty common. Herb Robert was fairly common, things like that. And then for this plots where we didn't rake and we did seed some things, we didn't see as nearly as stark of a contrast. Sometimes we saw like some really clumpy little patches of our seedlings from what we seeded, and other times it was not really that different from the rest of the forest floor. Okay, so that was kind of a visual glance. Now we get to actually, dive into some data from our plots. So first we wanted to know how many seedlings come up after we seed. So right now we're just looking at the baseline data, and what we're looking at is just total number of plants per meter square. So that's like a density of plants. And this is before we did any seeding. So just our baseline condition. And you can see there's a good number of the orange is invasive plants. So good number of those. Blue is non-native, but like not super invasive either. So that's things like wall lettuce. Orange would be something like blackberry or ivy. And then the lighter green are native species that weren't a part of our seeding mix. Darker green are part of the seeding mix of native understory species. So you can kind of see the general starting condition. Now we're going to go to year 1 after we raked and seeded. And you can really see, so now we're going to look at each of these bars represents one of our treatments. So the raked, where we didn't seed anything, is the first one. Then raked and seeded is the second. And you can see there were way more numbers of our native seeded species there. And then the last bar is the unraked seeded. So really this shows us that seeding gives you way more native species, and raking really helps with the germination. So then what did things look like in the second year? Well, basically we had a bit fewer numbers of our seeded native species, but still more than if you didn't do anything at all, or if you didn't rake but still seeded. So there's still a significant effect. And we would expect there to be a bit fewer numbers of these seedlings in their second year as things thin out. You know, you want the plants to grow. You don't want them to be so crowded together. So it's kind of like thinning lettuce. You know, it's just a thing you have to do. But it just happened naturally. All right. So that was kind of general germination trends of all of, you know, the native species together. But how about what particular species did really well? So basically, this is showing the brown bars are showing what our original percentage was of each species in our seed mix. And then the green is what percentage came in when we planted them. And really what you're looking for is the green bars to be, you know, equal to or larger than the brown bars. So that really means these species, inside out flower, small flowered Nemophila, which you might not know about, but it's a nice little native understory species. Miner's lettuce, a lot of the grasses like Western fescue and the Columbia brome, blue wild rye. So those were ones that germinated at high rates, meaning, you know, you get a bigger bang for your buck with those. If you seed them, more of the seed is gonna survive. Okay, so that's fine, you know, germination is great, but now how much growth are we gonna get out of these species? You know, how fast do they fill in the space? That's another question we had. So again, we're looking at our baseline data here, but now we're looking at the percent cover of plants in our plot. So if you look from the air straight down, you know, what percent is covered by invasives? And you can see baseline started out like quite a lot. You know, these sites had a lot of weed pressure and not very many natives. So what happened once we did our treatments and seeded in some cases? So here you can see kind of an interesting trend where, well, we did a really good job of removing the invasive species. Those orange bars are very small now. But there's not much of a change in the native species to begin with. And interestingly, the unraked plots have a bit more of a bump in their native species than the other ones. I think that's because they were not raked. They didn't have that disturbance to harm the native plants as well. But it's really in the second year where we start to see more growth, and especially of those species that we seeded. So, you know, it just takes them a little while to grow. Some of our invasives are also starting to come back. That's the orange, some of the non-native blues. But you'll find kind of interestingly that the invasive and non-native species don't take up as much space in the sites where we seeded as they did in the sites where we didn't seed. So, I mean, that really shows that seeding helps fill in that void so that the invasive species and non-native species can't come back as much. So, very fun. And just asking, you know, what species in particular really grow fast again. So it's This is the percent cover that each of these species reached after 2 years of growth. So the ones at the top of our list here are really the, the ones that grew fast. So sweet Cicely was the fastest growing, waterleaf, blue wild rye, the fescue. And some of that growth, I think, depended on how spread out the species were again, or how spread out individual plants were. So for example, this fringe cup grew really huge, much larger than most of the individuals of that species. I think that was just because it had a little more space. It wasn't crowded. Okay, and then finally, did any of our environmental factors that we measured have any effect? And the answer is, at least as far as we measured, only aspect really had much of an effect. I think part of the reason for us not seeing an effect from other things like canopy cover and slope is that we just didn't really have sites that varied a whole lot in those variables. But within aspects, we had enough variation between southern aspects and western aspects to see a little bit of a preference. So if you really want to dig into it, that's there for you. And finally, with our soil characteristics, we didn't get to dig too deeply into the specifics, but we do see that raking really improved seedling germination. However, raking also decreased the soil nutrients and the organic matter in the soil. We definitely saw that pretty consistently. And in some of our sites that had the lowest nutrients, plant growth wasn't as good. So you're in a little bit of a bind there, right? Raking helps with germination, but it hurts growth. So you kind of want to do just enough raking to really get your seed established, get plants established, but don't rake your whole forest by any means. So, kind of now putting this all to practical use and enhancing your forest floor. Just some good tips for planting. That site preparation, removing the invasives or doing the thinning was really important. So make sure you do that and pick the right species for your scenario. Like all the species we listed would probably be fine for any sort of general forest floor planting. Timing is important. If you're planting plugs or containers, fall through winter is a good time. For seed, you really want to seed in the fall because these seeds need to experience the winter in order to germinate. And really make sure that they get good soil contact. So, raking those little small patches or, just focusing on little areas where there's already exposed soil if you don't want to take the time to rake. So where to get these plants? For plugs or root fragments or small containers, there are native plant sales, retail and wholesale nurseries where you can get a lot of these understory species. So you can kind of just start out with a couple small patches and then they will seed themselves and spread over time. Unfortunately, right now, seed isn't really super available for a lot of these species. You can get some of the grass seed from some of these nurseries that I listed here. I highly, strongly recommend you focus on native species because you don't want to create a new invasive weed. The other option, if you do have woodland that has really healthy patches of native understory that doesn't have a lot of like weeds around it and those native species are already like coating the ground, is you can collect seed from those patches and then spread it into areas where you need to improve the understory. So that's why I say responsibly. You don't want to collect seed from areas that are already struggling because they need all the seed they can get already. Okay, so that's it for me. We're going to pass it back to Michael to finish off.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so I just have a few last slides for wrapping up here. And one of them is just this one here. So we talk a lot about trying to do some seeding into some shady areas. And so we're using shade tolerant species and that kind of thing, like Laura's talked about. And we have a couple photos on this slide. And the first one is just a really dark, dense Douglas fir plantation, about 15 to 20 years old. And that would be a site. If you look at that, you can kind of imagine how good would seed really work on the soil right there. Then you go to the right and you can see where it's grown up a bit. This is a different site, but this is just a Douglas fir plantation that's grown up to be a lot more mature, a lot more sunlight's hitting the ground, and you see quite the carpet of sword fern plus plenty of other plants out there if you looked closer. So that one on the left, you know, it may be that you could get the greatest seed in the world and it's perfect for shady conditions and throw it out there, but it could still be too dark to get anything to grow. So on this next slide, when it pops up, this is a project off of Germantown Road that's in the Tualatin watershed, where we thinned about 50% of the trees out of a stand just on 1 acre. And this was a site that had once been more of like a pasture area and it wasn't forested. And then it was planted to trees at 10 by 10 spacing. And so we helped this landowner thin probably from like 300 trees down to 150, something in that ballpark. And nothing was really planted besides an occasional plant picked up at a native plant sale. And you can see it's subtle somewhat, but there you go from a lot of bare ground with some sword fern to pretty thick sword fern. And if you were in there in the right time of year, you would have found fringe cup and waterleaf and a lot of the species that Laura talked about that came in naturally. So I just kind of add these couple slides to just talk about that. The seeding work's really important, but sometimes it takes other manipulations of the forest to really get this to work. And sometimes you can just thin the forest and do nothing else and you'll get a lot better understory if that's important to you. And this site that I'm showing you pictures of here didn't have a real nasty invasive species problem, which was nice. So it was able to thrive with natives. So just kind of in summary, you know, active management definitely influences the understory, whether it be thinning, whether it be seeding, or whether it be doing, you know, both of those things. Like Laura said, the seed does grow best in the raked areas. And it definitely increases in terms of percent cover between year 1 and year 2. And I think that was shown really well on Laura's slides, where you saw just kind of these dwarf little kind of plants and they were sort of booming and a lot of cover in the second year. So there's just patience, you know, if you're going to do some work like this, having some patience is important. Soil is somewhat depleted in raked areas. So what we noticed, and we don't have the biggest sample size you're ever going to see on an experiment here, but just in the plots that we did look at, when you raked it, in just a year or two, you would go down in phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and your cation exchange capacity would lower. And that's an important soil term for basically saying the higher it is, the better it is at grabbing those important positively charged soil nutrients. So that's why we kind of talk about rake some small patches, throw some seed out there, but don't go gangbusters and rake a half acre of your forest and cast seed all over the place. You're probably better off doing almost small islands. And I'd say it's something to think about too. If you see anyone who's being overzealous on wildfire, like fuels reduction, like they're almost vacuuming up the forest, which you don't see that often, but I've seen it a few times, is you could actually be hurting your soil if you're really freaking out about leaf matter on the ground and that kind of stuff. That's probably not an issue with very many people on this call tonight. Let's see. And then sometimes you get depleted soils, and this could be eroded soils that are thin. This could be compacted soils. One other thing we noticed in a couple of plots was that we had 2 different sites where it was trees that were planted in a former field, maybe a pasture field, or maybe it was kind of cropped at one time, where the soil numbers, you know, for all the different nutrients we were measuring never looked as good in those sites because forest soils are just typically better soils than a lot of our ag soils as far as just all kinds of organic matter and all this great soil health building up over time. Sometimes on those depleted soils, if they don't have a great history of being forest soils or whatever, you might just use a simpler mix. You might just start off by trying to build up more organic material with something like a blue wild rye grass mix that you throw out there. And then Laura's got us a couple photos of some of these workhorse species. You get a close-up shot of the sweet Sicily. So that might be one that you kind of recognize from your forest. We were talking earlier today, it's not the most charismatic wildflower you'll ever stumble upon, but still quite nice. And I think some pollinators like it, you know, but that's a nice one to have there instead of garlic mustard or ivy anyway. And then down below that is Pacific waterleaf. And that one's a great plant to have in your woodland because bumblebees will be all over that when they're active or when it's blooming. So that's kind of the summary. Thanks again to these partners. It was cool to get some funds from NRCS for sure to do this work. And the Bureau of Environmental Services, Clean Water Services, which a lot of you all probably know very well, including John Doomer, who's on the call. Metro, Portland State University, those guys really helped us come up with a great monitoring protocol to do this work and also helped us get seed mix. One last plug for Portland State, as a grad student named Erin Mcelroy has been doing a lot more work with similar data, and she's using our data plus a bunch of other sites to do more of like a thesis level report. She's a graduate student, so you'll see more replication and probably stronger conclusions from her study if you ever, you know, stumble upon that in probably the next 6 months or so when she gets a draft of that out there. And before we open it up to questions, if we still have time for that, Mike Clousey, I'll just say that if you find, it's almost easier to search on our website. You can just type in Forest Understory at wmswcd.org. And one of the first choices will pop up as a great page with a lot of information about this topic, including our technical report that we wrote for our grant, plus some fact sheets. Our July tree school presentation is linked there too. But honestly, you guys saw a better one because we're a little more conclusive in what we say this time around. And it's shorter, you know, who's got time to watch an hour-long presentation or whatever that was. So thanks a lot for listening, and we're interested in whatever questions you have.
All right. Excellent. This really was good. A little more focused. So there's several ways to ask questions, you all. You can raise your hand down in the reactions thing on the bottom where your toolbar is. If you click on reactions, one of them is raise your hand, and I will see that you want to say something verbally. And I'm going to stop sharing or ask Laura to stop sharing just so we can see more faces. The other is in the chat box, and I have a couple of questions in the chat box, and I also have a couple. And the one Mike already answered, Michael did, but I think it's a good one. So Lori Stoll asked, we've never seen a family woodland survey. Should we be looking for it somewhere? So go ahead and say what you said, Michael, and then I want to add a little more about the National Woodland Owner Survey.
Yeah, I mean, you might answer it better than I can, but definitely the Forest Service, I think it's every 4 or 5 years, sends out surveys to a sample of woodland owners around the nation. So you may or may not get one. If you ever get one, please fill it out and send it back because this data is great to have. But what's really cool is when you go onto the Forest Service's website and can find this thing, you can search it in a bunch of different ways, including just looking up the data for Oregon or the data for the Pacific Northwest. And so those numbers that I cited earlier were Oregon numbers, not national numbers. But the national numbers for people who are interested in wildlife habitat and that kind of thing, they're very similar to the numbers that I mentioned.
Good. Yes, it's called the National Woodland Owner Survey, and that's run by a scientist named Brett Butler, who is out of Massachusetts. And they have on the line, you can get the 2006 data, the 2013 data, and they've just released the 2018 data. And it's really interesting. In some places where they have a lot more woodland owners, you're able to get it down to the county level. In Oregon, it's just at the state level because the population here is so small that there's only 400 is the sample size. But it's just amazing when you look at the results from Oregon and compare what Oregonian small woodland owners value versus national or Pacific Northwest. It's a very, very tight community. So it's excellent. Really, it shows you, and over time, the thing I've seen is the care about things like biodiversity and understory vegetation and wildlife habitat have been increasing, and the care about just straight economics has been decreasing. People are still interested in economics, but not just straight. The other thing on this subject is Brett Butler, who is running the National Woodland Owner Survey, has a brand new book out, and it's just been released by the Society of American Foresters. And you can find that their website is eforester.org, and it's called Small Woodland Owners. And it's kind of a summary of what they've learned about small woodland owners in this country for 18 years of doing this survey. And it's some good information. I think it's the first SAF book put out in a while. So that's a good one. Another question that's in the box is from the shoemakers, and I like this one. How do you do the raking? Did you rake before the seeding, after the seeding, or both? So Laura, how do you do it?
Yeah, good question. So we just had some hard rakes, and it was before we did the seeding. So we basically just got our rakes and raked away all of the leaf litter and fir needle duff. So we tried to get it down to bare soil, and that's pretty much it. We did notice, that it's kind of hard to do because you're disturbing the soil, and we were digging up bumblebees in this one site where they were all like hiding under the duff and trying to overwinter, and we were disturbing them. But yeah, it's pretty simple before we seeded.
All right.
Were you
Good.
raking away the blackberries and the ivy, or were you raking around them? Because I can't imagine pulling them up.
Oh, great question. Yeah, so we actually did the invasive species removal before we went in and did any raking. And we typically, we used contractor crews who used herbicide and just really targetedly hit just the invasive weeds. And we may have, ideally we even had a couple rounds of treatment to make sure the weeds were really well under control before we went in and then raked and seeded.
So
Yeah, I'm glad
have
that question
ahead.
came up because that's an important part of the beginning of the work, is that we did like site preparation basically.
Right. So I have a question related to that. We have at Silverton that OFRI manages at the Oregon Garden, a real small 15-acre demonstration forest, old Christmas tree plantation, now 40 years old. Many of you have been there. The ground is almost totally covered with shiny leaf geranium. We have not found any herbicides that will kill it. So we can't just get rid of it. So as I listened to Laura and Michael talk, I thought, well, what if we, put in some real intensive micro plots and, maybe in a 20 by 20 thing, just really raked it as good as we could, get some species in there that would compete against the shiny leaf and get them going. Or the other would be to get some bigger plants and just a few and plant them in. Because I got to think that once we get it switched, we're not going to be with that forever, because it wasn't there forever, but it's like 100% cover. And right now it's just starting to look beautiful. But what do you guys think about that? Any ideas? I'd take that from anybody. We've been working on this for 10 years trying to figure this one out. We've gotten nowhere.
Well, I'm not the best expert on like what herbicides or treatments get rid of shiny geranium, other than just like a solid hand pulling in the actually like late winter, like right now when it's not like seeding or even flowering. That's feels like the time you can kind of get ahead of it. It would definitely be valuable to know if there were herbicides that were effective on it at that point, if you could get in there. But the trick with that species too is that it's really growing really solidly in the early spring, and so it's it's overtopping your little seedlings when they're just trying to get started. So you would really have to clear the geranium away, at least in those little patches, get something established and actually grown up, really intensely for a couple years. And then maybe it could,
Maybe
at
it
that
will.
point, I
So
think
really,
it could probably hold its own against the geranium.
so physical removal sounds like maybe the best option. Good.
I've
We have not
definitely-
tried that.
Yeah. Hand pull.
Someone
It's not
suggested
hard to
speed
pull.
zone herbicide. We haven't tried that either.
Oh.
So good. Good suggestions. Other
Mhm.
questions? We got just a couple more minutes, 3 minutes before we need to switch gears. And we can always come back if there are more, but no one's raised their hand. The faces I'm looking at. Oh, there we go. Go ahead, Mr. Larson. Ron, unmute yourself.
Bracken
Oh.
fern and sword fern, do they have friends?
Do you mean like, is there other ferns that would be good to use? Is that what you're asking, Ron?
No, specifically bracken fern and sword fern. They with a little light, they're very vigorous, but you hadn't mentioned them yet.
Are they
Yeah,
good?
One thing with the seeding work is there's only so much seed you can really get your hands on for this kind of work. And then our partners at Clean Water Services and these other ones I've mentioned came up with a good mix of seed that we used. Sword fern, I think, was really not chosen just because it's one of those ones that often is on a site. Like maybe not a lot of it, but some. And so we were able to just sort of count on it to expand on its own in most cases. But definitely, you can buy it as even I think at Brooks Tree Farm and some other places, you can get sword fern and plant it out there like as a bare root little plug or seedling, and it's great to use. It's great to hold in the ground, and it's excellent to have out there. I really like sword fern as cover for some even bird nesting. I've found bird nests under it in the forest several times, so that's a good one. But it was not part of our seed mix.
Good.
Yeah.
So we got one more from John and Kathy Doomer. How many years of site prep did you do before seeding?
For site prep, we did, some were better than others, I guess. Usually we had been into our second year of site prep right before we seeded. So say we had an ivy site, it probably got herbicide treatment in the fall. And then again, the next fall, as in like September. And then we probably put seed down in November, just a couple months later. On ivy, we'll often try to even sneak one other treatment somewhere in the middle of those two fall treatments, like one in the summer or spring. And blackberry was often treated once before we seeded, but probably should have been seeded or treated twice. But then the other thing is like, if you all do this, you'll do maintenance along the way, whether it be with the little spot spray or even loppers. And what we tried to do just to get good plant counts was we got kind of nervous about spraying once the seed was down because we didn't want to accidentally kill a plot. And we have contractors doing a lot of our work and they're great to work with, but just in case we messed up communication. So we would stay a good distance from the plot, which I think is a little of the reason why in Laura's numbers, we had maybe a little bit more invasives coming back in year two. If we just had nothing but time on our hands, we probably would have been in there with little, pruners cutting blackberries off and that kind of thing. But, which I know you guys all have nothing but time on your hands
Nothing
to
but
do
time.
that. So.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Really good presentation. And
Thank you.
Yeah.
now I would ask that we have Jennifer Beath and Wilda Cafferata and Sarah join us. And I will share the screen with their PowerPoint on it and then turn it over to Jennifer and she can take it away. Got to get rid of that and do this one. And I will now do remote control to Jennifer Beath. So you should have control, Jennifer. Why don't you test it? And I will just say that click on the slide and then try your forward arrow and backward arrow and see if you can make it work. Perfect. So
There we go.
This is a presentation that was sought after because of the OSWA Challenge Grant with the Oregon Natural Resource Education Fund. And the presentation has 3 parts. Jennifer Beeth from Starker Forest is the chair of ONREF, the Oregon Natural Resource Education Fund, and she'll go first, then hand it off to Wilda Caffaretta from Lane County Small Woodlands, and a teacher and a school board member and a forest landowner. And she's going to talk about the OSWA end. And then at the very end, Sarah is going to give us a closure and talk about the Oregon Community Foundation. So with that, take it away, Jennifer.
Thanks, Mike. And hello, and thank you for having me. My name is Jennifer Beeth. I have been a forester at Starker Forest for the last 23 years. And I'm going to talk to you tonight about the Oregon Natural Resource Education Fund. See, I guess this is the first time I've done the remote. There we go. Okay. So the Oregon Natural Resource Education Fund of the Oregon Community Foundation was established in 2001 to make grants for sustaining natural resource education programs in Oregon high schools. These grants are intended to establish, expand, and improve and maintain forest-related natural resource education opportunities in high schools. The fund, which is held by the Oregon Community Foundation, provides charitable distributions to Oregon public or private high schools that commit to providing educational opportunities in the field of forestry, which will integrate wood products, silviculture, harvesting, fisheries, wildlife, water, soils, recreation, and the management of other forest-related natural resources of Oregon and related career and leadership development. We have an advisory board with some committee members who you might already know. Jim Rombach, Pete Sikora, Nori from OFRI, Reynold Gardner from the Oregon Department of Education, Jim from OSWA, who that might be switching to Amy or possibly Jeremy. And then Julie Woodward has been involved with ONREF since it started. And so we aren't ever gonna totally let her go. We have subfund advisors for the subfunds of ONREF. And then John Moriarty, who is also in the meeting tonight, is our liaison with OCF, and he serves as or works as the senior program officer. So we have a main fund that's available statewide, and then there's 4 subfunds that each have specific funding objectives and local representation on the advisory committee. The current subfunds include the Terry Selby Subfund, available to qualified programs in Benton County, Oregon. I don't know why I said Oregon. I don't even know why I even put that on the slide, to tell you the truth. You know where Benton County is. The Pleasant Hill Subfund, currently available statewide, but preference is given to schools in Lane and Lane counties. The Oregon SAF Subfund, available statewide to qualified programs with the added commitment to promote post-secondary education and forest-based natural resource education. And the new Oregon Small Woodlands Association Subfund. So the teachers apply for the grants right now. The grants are actually due on March 1st. And there's 37 high schools in Oregon that have a statewide natural resource and forestry program of study. This is a approved CTE program through the Department of Education with their career and technical education program, and the Oregon Department of Community Colleges and Workforce Development, and then OFRI. OFRI's been a huge supporter of ONREF, and I don't think we could connect with the schools that we connect with without our collaboration with OFRI. There's 113 high schools in Oregon now that are teaching natural resources and forestry courses, and there's 157 high schools in Oregon that are providing natural resource and forestry education. So this has really been able to expand. When OFRI created its high school curriculum, several years ago, maybe 6-7 years ago. Mike probably knows exactly when it is. But it was brought to the attention of OFRI that the FFA teachers wanted to teach about forestry and natural resources, but their expertise maybe was actually in FFA. And so OFRE was able to bridge that gap with the high school curriculum in natural resources and forestry. And that's why you see that great big number of 157 high schools that can provide natural resource and forestry education programming in their school curriculum. So what kind of requests do we get? We'll find out next week. I will see how COVID is impacting things. I'm feeling like the teachers are somewhat overwhelmed and maybe are hesitant to even take the time to fill out an application, but I'm hopeful this year that they will. I know of at least one teacher who's planning on submitting an application. But here's a list of the general types of requests that we get for grants. And the first one I highlighted, tree forest measuring instruments, because that probably represents the greatest number of grants, of things that we give grants for. One of the teachers I was talking to the other day said he's going to be making an application for some books, that he needs a new set of books for log scaling. And he says he just has a few and they're really tattered, and he'd like to have a supply of books for the whole class. So there are also requests for forestry tools, wood splitters, chainsaws, and some of these items can really help to further support funding for these high school programs. So for example, the wood splitter is so that the high school forestry program can split wood and then sell the wood, and then that money goes right back into their program. So it's a really nice boost. Recently, we've had requests for wildland firefighting equipment, drones, as technology changes. Not too many requests for Biltmore sticks, but there's been some requests for drones. And then in recent years, we've seen more requests for kits, like collection kits, like the animal replica and fur collection kit, and water quality testing equipment is another popular one. So that we are in the grant application. It's every year we have this application window. Grants range from 500 to 3,000. We don't always give the whole amount that's asked for, but sometimes we do. It depends on what it is and how much money we have and how things are looking. Just typical to grant making boards, I think. We meet twice a year, and we have fantastic support from Oregon Community Foundation. It's really helpful. So we'll be meeting in a couple weeks actually to be reviewing the grants for this year. The grants are awarded in April by OCF. And then the teacher's obligation is pretty simple. They apply for the grant. If they receive the grant, then they're just required to submit a grant completion report back to us. We do require that in order for them to apply for another grant. Oops, I went too fast. There we go. Then what? So the teachers receive their grants. The students have new tools to learn with, and the teachers submit their completion reports to ONREF. So there's just not a lot of extra financial resources for teachers to purchase expensive forestry equipment. I mean, you all know how much an increment borer costs, or 10 hand compasses, or maybe a laser rangefinder so they can speed up the process for measuring trees. Even for a teacher to just have one or two of those devices can really help students. And if these teachers can help students learn math through forestry, that's great. The forestry teacher at Corvallis High School explained that to me, that he has students that flunk out of regular math in high school, but that they can go into his forestry class and he can still teach them the same math using forestry techniques and real world examples for learning. So I think that's a definite benefit of the ONREF grant program. So I'm going to pass it over to Wilda to talk about the role of subfund advisors. I am going to give up remote control And then what do I do, Mike?
So you just need to find her name on the list, so it'll show up when you say give up remote control. It'll show you a list of everybody at the party.
Well, now it says
Actually, I think I
request
could
remote.
do it.
I think I gave it back to you.
Okay, you have it. Wilda, you should have remote control. So if you click
Okay.
on the slide, then you can go forward. You're in charge.
Oh, perfect. I was wondering how that would work. All right. Well, I'm Wilda Cafaretta from Lane County, and myself and Tim Otis from Lynn County are the advisors for the OSWA Subfund. And we needed, you probably know this, we needed $25,000 to establish a subfund. And thanks to Benton County and Columbia and Lane and Lynn and Yamhill, and especially Washington County, we now have a fund. So Tim's role and my role as subfund advisors is to look over the grant requests every year and advise on which ones is in OSWA's interest to fund. When we look at the grant applications, we're going to be looking for how specific the application is, how many students it proposes to serve, the level of community involvement, whether or not the proposed budget seems reasonable, and whether or not the proposal meets OSWA's objectives. And we also plan to be involved in the awards of the grant, the presentations, so that when a teacher gets a grant, they come to a school board meeting or something like that, and an OSWA member will be there to present it and talk about OSWA a little bit at the same time. Whoops, that didn't work. So I just click on the slide.
I clicked on the slide and then pressed the forward arrow on
Oh,
my keyboard.
great. Okay, well, I went too far. Hold on a second. So I click on and click the back arrow. I'm not doing too well here. I need to get to my next slide. Let's see.
Why don't I take it back and
That'd be great.
control it for you?
That'd be great, Mike. I'll just say next slide when I do my next slide.
Okay.
I'm on
This one?
No,
that.
back one more.
This one?
Yeah, that one's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, just say next slide, Wilda.
I will do so. Thank you. It was interesting to me that OSWA's goals and ONREF's goals and the Oregon Community Foundation goals really do coincide. And I'm passionate about ONREF because I'm passionate about OSWA. And I see ONREF as a way to further OSWA's mission and the mission of the Oregon Community Foundation. In our bylaws and OSWA bylaws, there's a lot of bylaws we have, but two of them are to foster the wise use and protection of forests and to encourage better forest practices. And the second goal is to represent owners of family forest lands to the general public. If you look at ONREF's goal, they make grants that sustain and enhance forest-based natural resource education in Oregon's high schools. And if you look at the Oregon Community Foundation's goals, is to improve the lives of all Oregonians through the power of philanthropy for a healthy, striving, sustainable Oregon. So clearly, by making grants to promote forestry education in Oregon high schools, ONREF is helping fulfill OSWA's goal of disseminating information, as well as the OCF goal of improving the lives of Oregonians. And it's doubly true when we think that students are also being taught leadership skills, so that what they learn may be conveyed to others, and thus furthering dissemination. For example, Pleasant Hill High School recently held a leadership development event for its forestry and agricultural students, with local judges participating in the contest for beginning speaking and sophomore speaking and job interviews and so forth, all based on natural resources. So not only were the students practicing and demonstrating their forestry know-how, but the judges are being informed as well. So events of this sort may be sponsored by ONREF, helping students practice what they've learned and spreading information to the wider community. The next slide, Mike. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is to introduce high school students to forestry, and how proud I am of OSWA for furthering this effort. So many high schools have no idea that forests offer them so many career choices. Gene Kadama, who is the new president of the Society of American Foresters, expresses this better than I can. He wrote, quote, "When I was in high school, I didn't know what forestry was. In most cases, informing people about forestry for the first time when they're already attending university is too late. If we can figure out a way to provide more information about careers in forestry to high school, guidance counselors, and other organizations that have an interest in natural resources, I believe we can see more people going into forestry. And of course, OSWA and ONREF are those kind of organizations. And it isn't just we want to encourage students to find careers in natural resources. We want them to have a working knowledge of what active management of forests can accomplish. And I myself am an example of an ignorant high school student. Well, not anymore, but I was. When I was growing up, I loved trees and I loved the woods. I had no idea about forest management. My family was not involved in any way with the forest sector. If there had been forestry classes in my high school, my career might have taken a very different direction. Furthermore, I would have had a much better understanding of forest management much earlier in life. So when I became a small woodland owner, I would have been far more knowledgeable from the get-go. Obviously, it's way too late for me, but I'm very happy that OSWA is helping reach so many high school students. There are over 60 high schools participating, I think more now, in ONREF, and over $80,000 has been distributed since 2001. And one of our grandsons, who goes to high school in Hillsborough, is taking fire management classes. So I just, again, I can't tell you how important it is. Next slide, Mike. And then we come to the pandemic, and the high cost of doing business. Well, you might think there's no need for ONREF funding during the pandemic times. After all, the kids are not in class, they're not having the field trips. All of those things are mostly canceled. However, I can tell you that ONREF funding is more needed now than ever. As a school board member myself, I can tell you that school districts are strapped. The costs associated with the pandemic are high, ranging from updating software and updating hardware, purchasing software, and equipping schools to have students on campus safely. There's very little money for anything extra. You couple that with teacher creativity, and their teacher creativity is just boundless. Our natural resource teachers are devising kits for all kinds of projects students can do at home. They are marshaling guest speakers for online presentations. They are researching and creating software and other educational materials related to natural resources. So I expect a lot of grants requests coming in next week for materials related to those kinds of things. Furthermore, in the past year, some of the grants we made could not be fully implemented, but rather than having teachers return the funding, the grant deadlines have been extended. And it's exciting that schools are now in the process of reopening, and teachers will be able to implement some of those things. And finally, many high school students, like many of us, are feeling somewhat depressed at being cooped up during the pandemic. And having them focus on forests, on outdoor learning they can do both virtually and in their own backyards, not only adds to their education, but it helps their mental health. So I am truly happy that ONREF, OSWA, and OCF working together can make a positive difference in Oregon high school students' lives. And I'm particularly grateful to the Washington chapter for its ONREF donation. And that's my part of the presentation, Mike.
All right. Thank you, Wilda. I will now pass remote control to Sarah.
Thank you, Wilda. Michael, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Great.
There you are.
I'm so happy to be with all of you tonight, and just want to thank you for this opportunity to add to this great program. I also want to recognize my terrific and super grateful John Moriarty mentioned earlier. I don't think to speak that he's always available to help members of the Oregon Small Woodlands Association through their affiliation with the Oregon Community Foundation.
John just turned his camera on. Hi, John.
So we're going to take a shift here from the discussions of the last hour or so to take a look at an organization that it's big but kind of quiet. A lot of people know about Oregon Community Foundation. We're coming up on our 50th year, and Wilda already mentioned our mission. But I think it's important to think about three functions we have that are described in this strategic plan that we're working under right now. Giving, which many of your members have already exemplified, but we really work to inspire giving by supporting prospective donors with ways that they can give to support what they care about most. We advance opportunity for Oregonians through all the grant making we do and the scholarships that we give. Normally, we distribute about $115 million every year in grants and scholarships. But in 2020, because of the acute need for wildfire devastation relief and COVID-19 relief, we had so much giving in 2020. It was incredible, and we have distributed well over that normal amount of over 200 million in 2020. We work with communities. We engage communities, but we don't count cities, but also groups of people who have giving goals in common and interests, volunteering interests in common, like the Oregon Natural Resource Education Fund volunteers that you've met a few of tonight. Or maybe they're a community that's defined by their race or their socioeconomic status or other factors. But these three things are really speak to the heart of what Oregon Community Foundation does. And I try to advance to the next slide here. So tonight, I just want to touch very briefly on how you guys could support the fund that was set up. And so I'm distilling a conversation I would normally give about how to give from over an hour to 10 to 15 minutes. But if your curiosity is piqued, I hope you will follow up with questions. And at the end of my talk, I'll share some information about how to get in touch. When we talk about at our foundation about options for giving, you can give now. Donors give to us currently with different assets like cash and stock and real estate like small woodlands and their retirement funds. But they also give to us later, often through what we call planned gifts, simple bequests in their will, trusts, living trusts, retirement assets, stock, again, real estate, some of the same things people give to us while they're alive, life insurance, and this whole category called life income gifts. Next slide. Just takes a minute to advance. That's what's going on. So tonight I'm going to hone in on planned gifts because these are the kind of gifts that can help build the Oregon Small Woodlands Fund in some interesting ways. Some reason it advanced to the next slide, even though I didn't want it to. And I would love to get back to the prior slide. There it is. So why would we talk about planned gifts? Well, they can provide some really substantial income to a cause, like the Oregon Natural Resources Education Fund that we own and administer. The gifts that people give that are planned, they can either be unrestricted, which is like manna from heaven for most organizations, or they can be restricted. And you saw some examples, like there's a subfund for Pleasant Hill, and there's a subfund, the Terry Selby subfund for Philomath. So all of the ONREF subfunds are restricted, and the one for Oregon Small Woodlands Association is restricted. But also, if you think more broadly about it, it just offers you another way to give. A lot of people who volunteer their time and are able to do that don't necessarily have a lot of cash to give during their lifetime, or maybe their assets are tied up in real estate. So a planned gift through your estate enables you to really step up what you give by bequeathing or turning over the deed for real estate, for example. It's also a way to happen give during their life to continue that or to perpetuate that. There we go. So a planned gift would help a family or an individual with their own planning. It's going to help them with issues like maybe there's some family dynamics that they need to work around, or maybe for small woodlands owners, the younger generations don't want to take on the ownership of that property. So a planned gift could help solve some of those problems. It can help with financial planning because sometimes you can get an income stream for a planned gift that you give while you're alive. And of course, it meets philanthropic goals and it makes you feel good about supporting something that's really important to you. We say that a planned gift is a gift that an individual creates while they're alive, but it's going to take place at their passing. And so I've already touched on this, but the two broad categories of planned giving are bequests and retirement plan designations. And study after study shows that about 80% of all planned gifts are these simple bequests or retirement plan designations. And then the other category, the other 20%, is represented by life income gifts. When you want to set up a bequest, we could certainly help you with this, but here's a very high-level example. If you wanted to, you could name the OSWA Subfund in your will, your trust, and you would do it in this way. You might say, I want to leave 10% of my estate, or a dollar amount. So it can be expressed either way, as a fixed amount or a percentage, or maybe what's left in my estate after I support my children. So many different ways you can do this. But a simple bequest is something that you can work with your attorney to put into your will, your trust, and make sure you support this fund that you started last year. Life income gifts, though they represent just 20% of planned gifts, they're often the amount is quite large. And the whole idea behind these, that I hope this illustration shows you briefly, is that as a donor, you give an asset to create a life income gift. And while you're alive, or maybe it's not you, maybe it's for someone else that is near and dear to you, while that person is alive, they receive payments. They receive an income stream, much like in a commercial annuity. But after the person that's been receiving those payments dies, or sometimes people set these up just to last a certain number of years, whatever is left in the trust or the annuity, this life income gift, goes to charity. And so that is something that any of you could consider doing, any Oregon Small Woodlands Association member could consider doing to support this cause that Wilda and Jennifer talked about. All these types of gifts have very specific benefits, tax benefits, and pros and cons that Oregon Community Foundation gift planning staff can talk about with you. And open for the next slide here. Great. This chart, which I won't get into in detail, but it's something that you could get from us, shows you what the minimum gifts amount are to do these two types of life income gifts, $25,000 for a gift annuity and $100,000 for a charitable remainder unit trust. And you can see the different ages that are required to get going with these gifts. And these are set up working with a philanthropic advisor such as me at Oregon Community Foundation, but are always done in conjunction with consulting with your own professional advisors. Oops. And I'm going to stop here. I'm really trying to keep the time manageable here, but I like to emphasize with people that there are a lot of intangibles in making this kind of step to make a planned gift. when we are working on our wills and trusts, sometimes it can be maybe a little bit of a downer. People don't tend to talk about this kind of thing much, but you know, I've seen over my career that this part of planning is joyful, and it can really bring a lot of meaning and satisfaction to people because it celebrates your values, and it celebrates what you care about. So you can think about a planned gift to the Oregon Small Woodlands Association Subfund of the Oregon Natural Resources Education Fund of the Oregon Community Foundation as something that is life-driven, and that you are helping to create a legacy and support these students who are learning about how to take care of our natural resources. With that, I'll stop, and I want to just briefly say that you guys are my last presentation of this sort before I retire at the end of this month. So just in a few short days. And another wonderful and capable colleague of mine, Jackie Roth, does the same kind of philanthropic advising that I do. And she will be, from now on, working with John in this role. It's something I've done since 2002, and now Jackie's taking it on. And I hope that you won't hesitate to contact her. And I'm sending you right now this contact information in the chat, so you can copy that and paste it as well, because I don't know if you're going to get to keep this slideshow and have any of this as reference. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, and Mike can take charge again. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah and Jennifer and Wilda. And if you guys have questions, you can raise your hand either physically or emoticonally, if that's a word, or put it in the chat. But I have a couple. I always have some warm-up questions. So the first one, I guess, is for Jennifer or Wilda. Do teachers need to show that they're teaching forestry in their application process before they can get their hands on the money?
When we have our grant making meeting, we have an OFRE representative, Nori, which it was Julie Woodward for a long time, and Reynold Gardner from the Department of Education. And they know every teacher, it seems. And so they're well connected with the teachers and the teachers' efforts in teaching forestry and natural resources. So I'd say our grants tend to be towards teachers who are teaching forestry and natural resources, but we're also making grants for things like water quality testing, which might not be considered hardcore forestry, but it's a bigger picture.
And the kids are going to learn things that could help them in forestry. So great, good answer. So my second one might be more for Sarah, since it's more kind of the fund management. I know some funds in the world only give out of their earnings. And so the amount that can be available each year be really up right now, but maybe 5 years ago was really down. Other funds kind of set, we're going to target this much, and then they change periodically on how their principal grows, always trying to protect the principal. What kind of philosophy for giving does the ONREF and other funds that you guys manage do? How does that work?
Great question. Oregon Community Foundation works in this area Mike's bringing up, both through our investment policy and our distribution policy. So the ONREF funds, including the Oregon Small Woodlands Fund, are invested in our main investment pool, which right now has about $2.6 billion in it. It's a highly diversified pool that is invested in many different asset classes and has at any given time anywhere from 60 to 80 different investment managers. And so we're setting benchmarks for those managers, and we have professional oversight of that investment program. Part and parcel with that is our distribution policy. We follow federal legislation about the investment and management of endowed funds. And what we do is we give out every year between 4 and 5% of the market value of your ONREF subfunds. The board sets that policy every year, and this year, well, 2021 is about 4.35% is being distributed, but we calculate that going back 13 trailing financial quarters, so that if market returns have been volatile, it's not a feast or famine situation as far as how much money the committee gets to look, the advisory committee gets to look at and give us advice on grant making. So it's hopefully providing both steady growth through the investment program and steady payouts for grants.
All right. Sounds like 100 years of experience to come up with that policy. That's one of the best ones I've heard. Thank you. And very well explained too, Sarah.
Okay.
So there's a couple more questions, and one John Moriarty answered, but I still think it's a great question. Vic Hendricks asks, is this the first year the OSWA Subfund is giving grants? And John Moriarty says, Vic, yes, this is the first year. So congratulations. We're going to have money for schools that we wouldn't have had without OSWA. Then Jim Cathcart asks, is there a relationship between the Oregon State Forestry Education Council at OSU and the Oregon Natural Resource Education Fund? Jennifer would probably know that because I think you've been on both boards.
No, I had to look that up. So I have to say no, I don't think they're connected.
Okay.
Do you know more about the Forestry Education Council, Mike?
I don't, but I think it's related to, similar to the SAF, what is it called? The SAF Foundation, which is part of the OSU Foundation, which is the one you were, it's associated with that, but different. But I think it's related to the OSU Foundation rather than the Oregon Community Foundation.
Yeah, so I would just say no. I'm only like Googling it as I'm talking right now. I did serve on the Oregon Society of American Foresters Foundation, which provides scholarships to OSU students, well, college students, OSU students.
Right, mostly OSU, right?
Yeah. And there are some, there's similarities, but
yeah.
Now I have to go read up on the Forestry Education Council.
Yeah,
Thank you for that.
Jim. Always wanted to push the limit for us. Other questions from anybody? I'm going to open the participants thing so I can see if anyone has their hand up. Not seeing any. Anything that we didn't hear that you would like to tell us, Sarah or Jennifer or Wilda? Give us your 15-second elevator speech. I'm a millionaire and I'm on the elevator with you and we just have 4 floors and you need to get 100 grand out of me. What's your selling point?
Well, I'll go first in agreeing with what Wilda said, is that we are hearing that you have to get students in even middle school these days. And that's why there are a few programs around and events that we've participated in at Starker Forest with, say, Philomath High School, in getting those middle schoolers interested in natural resources. So it's younger and younger that you can expose kids to new things. But I had my 3rd and 5th grader out planting redwoods in a riparian area this morning, so I'm going for the really young ones.
Way to go.
Nice, nice. All right. Mike, I would say if you're the millionaire on the elevator, that we are really blessed to live in Oregon and blessed with natural resources. And we'd like to protect them and have them be sustainable. And the way to do that is to bring our children, our grandchildren along so they will understand and appreciate them as well.
Boy. Okay, Sarah, you got to close the deal now.
Well, our youth and their education and our collective ability to take care of our natural resources is our future. There's nothing else that's important as those 3 things. And Oregon Community Foundation will wisely steward the gifts you give, just like you wisely steward your own woodlands. And we'd love to partner with you.
Great. I think that those 3 statements kind of wrap up everything y'all said tonight. So thank you very much. Michael, do you have a last word there since you came on with the camera? You just wanted to to be there at the end.
Just wanted to be there and see it through to the end, but thanks again for having us. It's nice to get to share information about these things that we work hard on at the district. So we appreciate it.
All right. Thank you everyone for being here. Again, a reminder for next month, March 24th, same Zoom time, same Zoom station. Exactly, it is really the same address you came to tonight, 7 o'clock. And we will have Roger Byer and Amy Yonke from OSWA going to give us a legislative update. And thank you all for supporting OFREE.